Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, we've got the inside story of how some dedicated sysadmins kept their servers running after being hit by Superstorm Sandy. Plus, the Diginotar saga finally comes to an end, and we've got the analysis, plus a war story that'll make you groan, and a big batch of your questions, our answers. All that and a heck of a lot more on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP, Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly systems network and administration podcast. This is episode 82, and we streamed it live on November 1st, 2012. This episode's brought to you by GoDaddy.com, and I'll tell you more about them as the show goes on. And the live stream is powered by the incredible ScaleEngine.com. My name is Chris, and joining us every single week is our host, the admin, the professor, and the tech, Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, man, I amped it up for episode 82. Did you like that?
I saw that.
I kind of got all crazy because you know what we have today?
You're crazy.
Really big show.
We have a
Too much show?
Superstorm show.
I think most shows would make this 2 shows. That's how big this show is. They would say, no, what? You can't fit that much show. But you know what? Here at Jupiter Broadcasting, we've got a big show policy. That's what we have here. We got a big show policy. Actually, Alan, you have some great war stories from the superstorm that hit the east. And, of course, I think a lot of people heard about some websites going down. Of course, we've got some of the stories from that. But also just some other big news that came up this week. And we've got a packed feedback segment, war stories in there, and some awesome roundup links. So, I mean, this really is a huge, huge show.
It is.
So, why don't we get some of the business out of the way to pay the bills to keep these types of big shows on the air? And I just want to remind folks that as the holiday season approaches, we ask that you keep our affiliate links in mind. Go over to jupiterbroadcasting.com, and you can find at the very bottom of the site, of course, you could always, on the right-hand side, contribute directly to the network, and then you're directly funding us, which is, think about it. That's how this kind of content can stay independent, stay honest, is by keeping advertising down to a minimum and getting support from the people we really report to, you, our audience. So down there at the bottom of our site, we got links for Amazon and eBay and Netflix, which is great electronic gift, Newegg and ThinkGeek. ThinkGeek's amazing for stocking stuffers.
Where I did all
like
my
that.
Shopping last year.
See, now you're the kind of person I want to come over to my holiday parties, because the guy that brings the stuff from ThinkGeek, that's the person you want to hang with. That's absolutely the person you want to hang with. We've also got the Chrome and Firefox extensions.
I got you something from ThinkGeek last year. I don't remember what it is now.
You did. You did. In fact, you gave it to me.
It was something nifty, but
it was, and Dylan really liked it, if I recall, too.
Well, because I got both your kids' gifts as well.
Alan, you're so nice. You're
Yes.
so nice. My gift from you came from Newegg, which I believe
awesome.
I didn't even send it until like January.
I think it was March, but anyway.
We had a snowstorm. What can I say?
Yes.
What can I say? So thank you, everyone who supports the network by using our affiliate links. And, if you grab those Firefox or Chrome extensions, we tag a few additional affiliates like Monoprice, and we're adding all the different eBay sites in there and things like that.
I'm shopping at Monoprice next week.
Monoprice is great, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's
I did some price comparison. They sell a pack of 60 Velcro zip ties for cabling for like $8.
Nice.
I checked the hardware store near my house. They wanted $6 for 6 of them. That's $1 a piece versus like a couple of cents a piece.
Well, where I make a huge savings is all of this professional audio wiring, like, all the long XLR feeds and stuff like that.
Well,
20-30% cheaper on Monoprice.
Right. Well, the other thing is I'm getting a whole bunch of Ethernet cables in different colors, so I can color code my cabling. It's like LAN is going to be yellow and Internet's going to be orange, and the link aggregation groups are going to be green, and it's going to be all easy to read.
I got like the longest HDMI cable possible for less money than like the 6-foot HDMI cable from Best Buy. It's crazy. So I love Monoprice, and we're adding them to our extensions soon. And those extensions, since now those are in the browser stores, will just automatically go out to folks. So thank you, everybody.
Yep.
All right, Alan, boy, where do we start with the Superstorm stories?
There's a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, I think we have a few war stories in here. I've got a few pictures I'll show as you go, so I'll just let you start and we'll dig in.
Okay, so the top of the story comes from datacenterknowledge.com. They have kind of a roundup of a bunch of the different data centers and what their disposition was. But a lot of data centers in New York and New Jersey suffered various issues from just problems with their connectivity because down trees were wrecking fiber lines, or your data center stays online because you have power, but a data center down the street that you connect to get to the internet loses power because of flooding or whatever, and then all your servers are on, but they can't reach the internet, so they're not really any use. You're just wasting diesel at that point. So ahead of you want to spool up the YouTube video in the links here?
Oh, sure.
Ahead of the storm actually landing, Con Edison, which is the utility company in New York, was proactively shutting down sections of the city to prevent damage to their equipment. Because, as you might see in Chris's video, when he spools it up here, very bad things happen when salt water meets high voltage gear.
Is that what happened to salt water? So this thing's it's like the electrical equipment's exploding.
Yes.
It's quite a startling, and Alan, I actually saw several videos of this. I didn't see this one, but I saw a couple of other ones of the same thing, people in the street videotaping and just some sort of power center just blowing up like this and lighting the whole sky up.
Yeah. So most data centers had already proactively switched to off-grid mode. So, Con Ed told them ahead of time, we're going to be shutting down the power at this time. So before that, they started up their generators, make sure they all come online nicely and all ready to go. And then, so they're running off generators. So when the power went out, it didn't affect them at all. So that was good. Slashdot has a page here kind of covering a lot of the same stuff. There's a thread
pulled together really well on this stuff.
There's a thread at Web Hosting Talk where various administrators were talking about, which of their servers were up and which were down and trying to figure out, a lot of different providers around New York are contained in like 4 specific buildings, different providers on different floors and so on. And so they're trying to correlate, all right, so all these providers are in the same building and they're experiencing this problem. And then there's these, or this backbone provider is having trouble moving packets because of power failure in their core infrastructure or because of cut fiber lines and so on. So it was really an ad hoc effort to figure out what was working and what wasn't still. And also, a lot of the companies, some companies were communicating publicly, broadcasting out to the internet the status of their equipment or, how much power they had left or whatever. But some were only reporting to their customers. So they did...
like directly?
Yeah. So basically, the customers were then posting it on Web Hosting Talk so everybody would know what every provider was saying. Although the moderators were policing the thread pretty heavily to make sure it was only posting status information. If you want to complain about an ISP not doing a good job, go to a different thread to try to keep the thread on track. And then the WER, which is the Web Hosting Industry Review, they had their noise filter segment had a bunch of details about the disposition of the various data centers. Equinix, which is a big... They own a lot of the data centers and then rent parts of them out to different ISPs. So they have a blog post about how they prepared and what happened for them. They did fairly well, although they had a generator break down on them and cause certain stuff to lose power.
That's just one of those things that you just don't know what's going to happen until it's under load, right?
Yeah, although that's why most places have redundant generators, right?
That too.
So when one breaks down, you have a spare one.
Right. That's always handy.
But, if you're running off the spare one because the other ones are underwater, then, how do you can't always have a spare of the spare of the spare kind of thing.
Yeah, you're just kind of stuck.
One ISP, Datagram, went completely offline because of flooding. Which took out Gawker, the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, and a bunch of other websites.
Yeah, Gawker had to fall back to a Tumblr blog.
Yeah, because I wasn't sure by the time people come to read the story, maybe in a couple days, that their website might be changed. I did a freeze page of their website showing the status as it was when I was doing the research for the show, and they have a huge string of updates talking about how they're dealing with it and recovering from it. They suffered the same problem with a bunch of different data centers in New York did, which I'll get to in a second. But they also note that another ISP came to the rescue. Verizon came over and helped them pump out water out of their basement.
Wow. That's really nice. I'm sure that's
and then
that cost them some money.
They had to bring like a truck-mounted generator to the site to power everything because the regular generators were broken by the salt water.
Oh, geez, sure.
And, there was roads are all tore up from the water and there's just crazy traffic and parts of this of New York are still under mandatory evacuation, so it's fairly difficult for them to get a generator to the site. And then, they had to wait for clearance from Con Edison to be even allowed to bring them, because the bylaws about you can't just have a giant truck generator running in the street all the time. And then TechSNAP, which is another large ISP, they are at the 75 Broad Street building. They completely evacuated their personnel. Basically, once flooding had destroyed their generators and they only had a couple hours from their day tank left.
Yeah.
They're like, it makes more sense to shut down and leave rather than risk anything and stay here.
Wow.
Because there wasn't anything they were going to be able to do anyway.
Yeah. And they didn't know how long things would be bad.
Yeah. Because utility power is probably not coming back for somewhere between 2 to 5 more days. And then, with their generators are destroyed, then that's that.
Right.
So they did a post on Pastebin, and they said the flooding has submerged and destroys the site's diesel pumps and is preventing fuel from being pumped to the generators on the mezzanine level. The available fuel reserves on the mezzanine level are estimated to support customer load for approximately 5 to 7 hours. So basically, it seems that in New York, building code prevents you from storing a lot of fuel on the upper floors of a building.
I was wondering.
Because it's a danger to people in the building and emergency personnel if there's a fire, right?
Yeah.
The firemen don't want to be running up into a burning building and then a giant diesel tank explodes.
Right.
So the generators are located in the basement with a very large fuel supply. I think it was like 20,000 gallons. And then some customers have their own generators on the upper floors. And those have what's called a day tank. It's just a small tank that runs for like 6 hours or 8 hours or so. Right, it's about the maximum amount of fuel they're allowed to store on the upper floors. And then normally those are fueled from the big tanks in the basement by pumps. Right, but those pumps ended up being underwater and being destroyed by the salt water. So those pumps couldn't pump the fuel from the underground tank to the day tank. I saw some people on web hosting talk asking, well, why don't they put the pumps up with the generators on like the 17th floor? But pumps don't work like that. The pump has to be near the fuel supply, because if it was on the upper levels, the pipe would be full of air between the tank and the upper level. And the pump couldn't prime itself. It couldn't create enough vacuum to suck the diesel up 17 floors. Right? So instead, you have to put the pump at the bottom and push the fuel up so that you're pushing against fuel, which is a lot harder to compress than air.
Yeah, of course.
Or easier to compress? Whatever. Anyway.
I didn't even think about the fact that there'd be that huge air gap.
Yeah, so basically the pumps have to be at the bottom, and therefore they didn't work when they were underwater.
Right.
So due to the flooding, it cut off their fuel supplies and drowned their generators. They couldn't stay open. Some data centers that did manage to stay powered up were they had the problem of they lost all their transit because of fiber cuts. And, if all your internet connection comes from a building down the street over a bundle of fiber,
right,
and that building loses power, then
what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Yeah, that's a real bummer when you manage to get all your stuff working, but they go down.
Yeah. So Pier 1 is the same building as TechSNAP, that 75 Broad Street, but they're on the 17th floor, and I think TechSNAP is on like the 3rd floor or something.
Oh, okay.
They provided customers with hourly updates via their forum. And then what they did is staff and customers from Pier 1, I have links here to a couple of customer stories about it as well, took to carrying barrels of diesel fuel up from outside to the 17th floor to keep refueling the day tank.
And they did this for hours, right?
Yes.
They took barrels.
I think it was like 2 days almost.
The Verge has a little of actually quite a write-up on this.
Yeah. And then Fog Creek was one of the customers that was helping. Wow. They drove around the city, rounded up their people, who their cell phones were dead and they had no power, so they couldn't contact them except for showing up at their house and knocking on the door. I rounded up the people, then started going around to gas stations and filling up with diesel fuel and then taking it down to the data center.
I mean, just the physical task of that is extremely grueling.
Yes. Pier 1 talks about moving half full 50-gallon drums of fuel. I did the math. 25 gallons of diesel fuel weighs somewhere between about 150 and 180 pounds.
Oh, doing that for hours up 17 flights?
It's 17 stories. So
17
usually the
stories.
stairs will have a switchback.
Yeah.
So that would be twice that number.
Oh my gosh. You know,
Yeah.
that's like superhero sysadmin style right there. That's what
Yeah.
that is. That's superhero sysadmin.
Obligatory link to the XKCD of the die-hard sysadmin.
Right. Gosh, that almost puts that to shame.
Yes. So I did a quick chronicling of Pier 1 updates. At about 5:40 p.m. on October 29th, they transitioned to generator power in anticipation of Con Edison turning down the power grid. A couple hours later, they were still on generators, and the building was reporting that the lobby was taking in water. About 2 hours after that, the building had detected flooding in the first and second basement levels due to the storm surge. The extent of the damage wasn't clear because they couldn't get into the basement to look. But the primary fuel supply was down, basically.
Wow.
And so all they had was a header tank, which, from what I was able to determine, was a tank on the roof that would gravity feed the day tanks in the lower levels. And it had about 5,000 gallons of fuel and would provide Pier 1 with enough power for somewhere between 12 and 24 hours. And they also observed that the water level outside seemed to be going back down, so they hoping that the flooding wouldn't get any worse. 3:30 the next morning, or that morning, they were still running on emergency power. The water had receded, and they're waiting for a report back from the building engineers on the status of the fuel and power systems located in the basement, because they were hoping to get power back from the building instead of having to rely on their own generators. 8 a.m. on the 30th. At this point, they estimate they have about 4 hours of fuel left for their generators. And the techs and facility people are continuously working to get an emergency fuel delivery on time to keep their generators up. And they're looking to set up a temporary tank and pump system since the basement is still flooded. In the event of not receiving the fuel on time, their worst case scenario is having to gracefully shut down all the servers in the building. Or in the site, anyway, which is the 17th floor of the building. 8 hours later at 4 p.m., the Pier 1 Hosting's New York data center remains on generator power, with fuel still being provided by the remaining building supply, which would be the header tank. Basically, they didn't expect it to last that long. I think it might have had to do with the fact that TechSNAP, one of the other people in the building, shuttled their stuff down and left, leaving more fuel for Pier 1. The fuel tank arrived at their facility, but due to flooding conditions in the basement, they're working on an alternate method to get the fuel to the 17th floor. As of now, our data center team is carrying half-full 50-gallon barrels of diesel to our daily fuel reservoir on the 17th floor until a more sustainable solution is reached.
Wow.
I can't even imagine. Each of those weighs more than me, which is something.
You got to really respect this huge effort these guys took. Because, for some startups, downtime is life and death. From some companies, it's huge cost.
Yep.
And they really took this on themselves.
In the case of a natural disaster like this, it's, some people will be more understanding. But, Pier 1 has 100% uptime SLA. They have to pay you back a lot of money if they don't keep the power on. So they were working as hard as they could.
I'm sure that played a component too, but they really...
But it was more that, the people that work there take this job very seriously and do everything they can.
Wow. Well, this is, it did work out. Like, they got coverage on the New York Times and stuff like that. It did work out in their favor. They got some great publicity out of it, as they should.
Well, the story's not over yet.
Oh, okay.
At the stroke of midnight there, so that's the beginning of October 31st, they were still maintaining generator power, but they were noticing temperature increases in Site 1. And they were trying to address that with technicians. 4 hours later, still maintaining generator power for customers in Site 1 and Site 2, but the temperature in Site 1 is running at critically high levels. At that point, they're starting to call all their clients and asking co-location clients to turn off any non-essential equipment to try to combat the temperature rise. And because A, it would give them more time on the generators, and B, it would try to keep the temperature from getting to the point where it's going to start damaging equipment. So then their technicians were going to go ahead and start shutting down equipment within the next hour. A few hours later, they had completed the shutdown of all equipment in Site 1. And they reported that the air conditioning in Site 1 is powered off the building's generators rather than their own. And because the building generators were down because they're underwater, that left them with not enough cooling. The temperature had stabilized, but if they bring Site 1 back up before the building generators are back up, it'll just overheat again. And that won't be very useful. So then they were working to try to find a workaround for this, but they were having trouble getting an electrician on site to actually do it. And so they were working with the building to try to get the building generators back up so that they could power the air conditioning again. An additional additional spare fuel is still being manually dragged up to the 17th floor for their generator.
Oh, still?
Yeah. And this is 10 a.m. the next day. So I think they've been dragging fuel for a whole day.
Yeah, I thought it was just a few hours.
No. A couple hours later, they maintain generator power for customers in Site 2, and Site 1 is powered down. The temperature of Site 1 is starting to stabilize, but they're not turning power back on because it would just overheat again. An electrician is on site and is currently working to move electrical circuits to bring a portion of the crack or computer room air conditioner units in Site 1 back online so that they can start powering up equipment again. So once that was ready, they were going to call individual customers and start powering stuff up a little bit at a time. So 11 p.m. last night, they still maintaining generator power for all customers in Site 2. The temperature of Site 1 is stabilized, and they were shortly going to begin the process of powering things back up because the electrician managed to rewire some of their air conditioners to run off the generator on the 17th floor instead of the building generators in the basement. And they still had enough fuel. So 1 p.m. this afternoon, still on generator power, an update from the building. Pier 1 provided the building with a fueling hose so that they will allow them to start filling the building's fueling tank so that can then power everybody else in the building.
So Pier 1 doesn't even own the fuel tanks and stuff.
Well, they have their fuel tank on the 17th floor, but the one in the basement is owned by the building.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so they lent their fueling hose to the building so they could refuel the tank that will refuel everybody's day tanks in the rest of the building.
That's very nice of them.
As of 30 minutes ago, Pier 1 is still maintaining generator power. The building is currently pumping fuel into the 5,000 gallon header tank. And Pier 1 expects to cut over to fueling from that tank in about 90 minutes. So then they won't have to continue to carry fuel up to the 17th floor. And, the next update will be in about half an hour.
Wow, so this is still going. This is craziness. Yes. Now, has any of scale engine systems been affected? Do you have anything in that area?
No. We have only a small number of servers in New York at a different data center that lost power but wasn't flooded, and they have about 5 days of fuel as of when it started and refueling contracts. So they expect to be able to operate with no problems.
I wonder if we'll see policy changes take effect regarding the way those fuel tanks and where they can be in a building.
Right. Now, the reason for the policies with respect to like fire code makes sense.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again?
Yeah.
Although, most of these setups were designed to deal with things like the 2003 power outage. Not, flooding is a really unusual event.
Yeah, that's true. Especially, yeah.
And I don't know if it's possible to make a flood-proof basement.
Well, no. I just wonder, too, where do we draw the line and just say, it's okay to be down? It's okay. You know what? Superstorm. We can be down for a little bit.
See, our servers in New York for Scale Engine could have gone down without it hurting us.
Right.
Because they're part of basically a cluster.
Yeah.
And, it just means, traffic from people in New York was probably going to be way down anyway. So we didn't need to load balance as much of it to New York. right?
Yeah, good point. Demand's not going to be quite as high.
Right.
Well,
So basically, our load balancer would have just shifted load to like Chicago and Atlanta or Dallas and so on. But a lot of these people, it's co-located equipment. It's
yeah,
not
right.
It's not necessarily cloud stuff. And so a lot of people did have to shift their stuff. But a lot of smaller places don't have the money to maintain co-locations at multiple different data centers.
This is a
And the main idea when you're doing co-location, which is where you own the equipment and you're just renting the space to put it in.
Yeah.
You usually do that somewhere near you, right? Because if
You
something
might
goes
wanna go
wrong,
to it.
you have to go to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're paying remote hands or for a managed co-location or something, it's your responsibility to maintain your hardware. You're just renting space, power, and connectivity.
And there's some advantages to that.
Yes. Well, it's usually quite a bit cheaper because you're not paying for the data center to keep people on site 24/7, or paying people enough that they're willing to carry 25-gallon fuel drums up 17th floor.
Not that you have all the copious time in the world, but you might want to listen to Coda Radio 20 because we came on this from a developer standpoint. Michael's thinking, I have this new thing I want to build, and do I go colo, which is kind of the old method in his head, or do I go like with a VPS or something like this? And now after seeing these storms, you do kind of think the one machine in a rack somewhere might not be the best approach anymore for high availability.
Right.
Well, it isn't.
Well, even for Scale Engine, we have 2 racks full of gear, but we couldn't really co-locate it somewhere other than Toronto because it would be inconvenient for us to go there and service it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, yeah.
And so that's why most of Scale Engine Network is made up of rented servers where they have to provide the physical part, right?
Right.
We don't even own the machine. So when a component in the machine fails, that provider has to replace it for us.
Yeah.
And we usually have an SLA on that saying it has to be replaced within 4 hours of us reporting it. Otherwise, we get a refund.
Right. And you usually get like all the other niceties too, like an IP KVM and a ticketing system and a remote reboot panel.
Right. Well, in our own racks, we have our own remote reboot devices, and all of our newer servers have the IP KVM because we won't buy a server without it anymore.
That's right, Alan.
So awesome.
Good man. Well, so that's the data center side.
Yeah, and then I have a couple other links, including the New York Times has an interactive live thing called The Aftermath of Sandy.
It's still being updated. It's really good.
Updated continuously with all kinds of information.
Long timeline list. It does make your browser chug a little bit because it's very long, but it's got embedded.
It started on the 28th, and it's the first.
It's filled with videos and images and all kinds of stuff. And speaking of that, Unfilter tonight. So it's going to be episode 24. If you're watching this a couple days later, we're going to kind of look at the media's coverage of the whole storm and play some of the clips from the media and look at that whole, traditional Anderson Cooper goes out in the field and he's standing in a puddle. We're going to look at that angle of it, and also the cell tech angle of it. The cellular networks, T-Mobile and AT&T are doing network sharing and things like that right now. So we're going to talk a little about that in episode 24 of Unfiltered.
Just to clarify, those aren't cell networks anymore, but anyway.
Well, wow, that's weird. Your image is all wonky all of a sudden. What should I call them?
Well, it's just mobile network, but basically it's not actually based on cell technology anymore.
Yeah, okay,
It's a term that we still use over here, but people
you guys don't call it cell over there very much anymore?
No, well, in Canada probably still, but most of Europe they're just called mobile phones.
Yeah,
right?
you know what? You're right. Anytime we get an email in from somebody that's over there, they always call it mobile. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Well, it's all cell here. Cell service, cell plan, cell phone. It's all cell.
Yes, because when it started, it was based on a cell technology. Right. Now it's more of a mesh network.
Well, geez, the news is just getting started. We've still got
that's just the first news story. I still have some more.
We still have a hell of a lot more show to get through.
And there was another news story that I bumped into a war story instead.
I got to tell you about my big story this week, and that is GoDaddy.com. I have got good news. Bonus round! We have unlocked the bonus round. I called up Danica, and I said, Danica, look, the folks are loving these awesome promos. In fact, I have a testimony here from somebody who used one of our promos. They said, look, you got to get this thing extended. So listen, GoDaddy.com, longtime sponsors of the show, and they've got some awesome codes that they just keep on giving with these codes. If you want to get a .com for $5.99, use our code $5.99 tech when you check out. $5.99 tech when you check out. Get you that .com, $5.99. That's just absolutely insane. And if you want to save 20% on your entire order, well, maybe you're doing some renewals, maybe you have a few other things, some hosting you want to do, use our code GO20OFF Go 20 off 5, 20% off the whole order, which is great. But I got an email here from Alex. He sent it a little while back, and I thought, I'll tell people one way that folks out there can use these codes to make their lives a little easier. You guys are a tech crowd, and so I picked this one out. He says, I recently bought myself a GoDaddy domain with your awesome code 599tech. I use this domain to point my home address with a dynamic DNS provider. I can then SSH to my workstation from work without any problems. I forward some ports on my router, and I find it great and really useful to bring my laptop to work with me and connect to my home system. And we've gotten emails like that before, and it just reminds me, if you need a really easy solution to get remote access to your home network, and that's a topic we talk about all the time on this show, use that 599 tech to get a $5.99.com, point that thing to a dynamic DNS provider, and there you go. That's how you get to your home network. So, and that'd be a great way.
With the name you can remember.
Yeah, it's a great way to get
instead
something
of a really long one that you get.
Super easy, customizable, and then later on you could add email services. You could point to Google Apps and do a hosted email with using your own domain or something like that. And it's a great way to support the show, too, by supporting our sponsor. So thank you to GoDaddy.com for the longtime support of the TechSNAP program. And thank you to everybody who supports the show by supporting our sponsor. All right, Alan, what is the next story we have in the news lineup?
Yes, 70% of the chief information security officers for each of the U.S. states reported that they had some type of breach in the last year.
Okay. So what is this, 70% of what?
Of the CISOs, the chief information security officers.
Just like individual of business?
No, of the states themselves.
Okay.
Of the state.
Okay.
They also reported that between 2010 and 2011, only 14% of them got a budget increase as far as cybersecurity, while 44% saw their budget stay the same, and 34% got budget cuts.
Wow.
And only 24% of the CISOs are confident that they can actually safeguard the data in their network from outside attacks.
I buy it. I believe it.
It's online at all, but
I don't see any reason to doubt that.
Well, we've covered a number of the stories about different, state health or other agencies being compromised and
there's just a big social security leak, right?
Social security numbers and all kinds of other information.
I mean, I'm always, especially because this is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, because there is cyber legislation that is.
But this is a report that comes out twice a year.
Yeah, I'm saying I believe it. I buy it. I don't think it's high. I mean, the timing's great because it is.
Right. Although some of the solutions was like, businesses should work together with the government. It's like, it sounds like they just want to spend a lot of money on, out of the box corporate solutions that make your network secure.
So Janet Napolitano was just at a Washington Post sponsored cybersecurity summit event that was probably paid for by some sort of cybersecurity firm. And she's sitting up there, and she says she's going on and on about the cost. She said she said that cyber attacks last year cost the United States $400 billion if you factor in the downtime and the repair time. And she said that number and the number of attacks comes from Norton. So you have the head of the Department of Homeland Security who would be overseeing all of the cybersecurity legislation, and everything that gets put into place goes underneath the Department of Homeland Security. She's using Norton as her number of her benchmark. So I don't buy all this stuff, but these types of reports, these are the types of reports these people should be quoting and following, because this is legitimate stuff, not something from some antivirus author.
This one isn't that great either, honestly. It's
really?
It looks like it's just a survey they sent to these people and had them fill it out.
But now so I'm making the possibly erroneous assumption that because it's being filled out by the IT people, that it's got to be more accurate.
Well, yes, but a lot of the questions are like, do you feel very confident, mildly confident, not confident, very unconfident that you can defend your network?
Well, who's going to say very confident?
24% of them said they were very confident they could defend their network.
Well, I'd like to go check that guy's network out then.
Yeah, it's just, a lot of it is kind of wishy-washy. But, the solution isn't necessarily more money. It's just do a better job.
It is funny just to watch all this stuff come out like this in just a steady march. But I got to figure they're probably a lot of the states in the United States are facing major budget issues, and they're probably cutting back on IT funding. That's what they do. I hate that.
Yep.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Nope. There's a link to the PDF for the full report.
All right, then. I believe we have an update with Diginotar, don't we?
Yes, which was one of the stories we covered August of 2011, I think. Quite a while ago.
Nobody can say we don't follow up.
But the report on the final disposition of the company, which is now bankrupt and so on, has come out. And they said that the attacker who compromised Diginotar's certificate authority had full control over all 8 of their certificate issuing servers.
Aha, we wondered.
So he didn't just compromise, one of them or something. He, completely owned them.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah.
Are you chatting right now?
No, I'm doing math.
Okay.
So the report suggests that the attacker may have issued more rogue certificates than we ever found out about. Remember, there was a list of like 400 or something?
Oh, yeah.
But looking at the logs of what the serial numbers should have been and what they actually were, there seemed to be a bunch of holes of certificates that might have been issued, but never actually, that they didn't find. So they don't know what happened with those. The risk of these unknown rogue certificates is mitigated somewhat by the fact that most vendors like Microsoft, Mozilla, Google, etc., revoked all trust in the Diginotar certificates. But customers who didn't receive those updates, if you're running an old version of Internet Explorer without your Windows updates, or you're running an old Firefox or an old Chrome or, old anything, even iOS and so on,
a lot of people
then you could still be vulnerable to these certificates that could allow someone else to pretend to be Google. Remember, that's how we found out about the Diginotar hack, was that in Iran, the government was spoofing, doing a man-in-the-middle attack against Google for people using Gmail. And it was found that they were using a wildcard certificate for star.google.com, and it was a legitimate certificate. And then by looking into that, they found, the reason, or the way they got this is that it's a certificate from Diginotar, and they say they didn't issue it, so, they went on to do that. The company investigating the compromise also found that the log files for the servers were stored on the same server, right? So they didn't log to an external server.
Classy.
So that meant that when the machine was compromised, those logs are then considered compromised. Also, they found evidence that the logs had actually been tampered with.
Oh, they did? They did, yes. Huh?
So while these logs could be used to make inconclusive observations regarding what unauthorized access or actions took place, the absence of any suspicious entries in the logs cannot be used to conclude that there was no unauthorized actions because the logs have been tampered with. Okay. So, anything it said in the logs might have happened, but just because it wasn't in the logs doesn't mean it didn't happen because the logs were tampered with. That's why it's better to have some kind of secure logging where you're sending it out to an external server, which is then like hashing the logs as it happens in such a way that they can never be altered.
Syslog.
Well, you need something a little more than just syslog, but yes.
I've been using syslog primarily.
Well, that does it, although it doesn't take care of hashing the logs in such a way that they can't ever be modified.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Investigators also found evidence that a claim by the anonymous hacker who compromised the Komodo Certificate Authority, he later said that he was also responsible for Diginotar, and the investigators found some evidence that seems to concur with that there was some elements in common between the two attacks, and it may have actually been the same person that compromised both.
Okay. Not too surprising, I suppose.
The Diginotar network was highly segmented, and a number of the segments were purposely isolated from the public internet so that, someone couldn't just hack into the certificate authority. However, a lack of strict enforcement of some of their policies may have allowed the attacker to island hop. So basically, he started by compromising a web server in their external DMZ. That's where you're supposed to put your web servers, right? So he broke into one of their web servers. That was the first entry point of the intruder, and that was about June 17th of 2011. From that web server in the external DMZ, the intruder managed to compromise some systems in the Office network sometime between the 17th and the 29th of June. Once he had compromised some servers some computers in the secure Office network, in the Office network, he then managed to jump into the secure network segment. that contains the certificate authority servers, and sometime around July 1st. So their network prevented what they didn't want to happen, somebody compromising the web server and then jumping into the secure network. But by jumping through some computer in the regular office network, which had been allowed into the secure network, probably, to
admin it or something.
Yeah, to make somebody's life easier so they can copy some files or something.
Susie can just update
by
the
hopping
PDFs.
from the DMZ to the office network, you could then get into the secure network.
Yeah, there you go. We've talked about that a lot.
Yeah, they found specialized tools recovered on those systems in the various segments, which were used to create a reverse tunnel that allowed the intruder to make a direct internet connection to Diginotar's certificate authority systems using remote desktop protocol.
Windows boxes.
Yeah, so their secure servers were Windows boxes, which were isolated from the internet, but by hopping through a compromised web server and a compromised Office PC, they managed to tunnel a connection into the certificate authority servers and get remote desktop access to those servers.
Jesus. I mean, they're just there at that point then.
Yeah. Based on that, the attack on Diginotar went on for about 6 weeks without being detected, from when he initially compromised the first web server to when he actually issued the fake certificates.
Oh, this is killing me.
Diginotar is now bankrupt and out of business.
Good.
Yeah. The private keys for their certificates are stored in a net HSM, which is a hardware security module, which basically you need a smart card to make it encrypt anything or to sign a certificate. No records could be provided by Diginotar regarding if and when smart cards were used to activate the private keys, except that the smart cards for the certificate authority managed for their CCV CA server, which is used to issue certificates used for electronic payment in the retail business, those smart card keys have been in the vault the entire time and were never used. So they may not have compromised that one set of keys, but apparently Diginotar doesn't have logs about when the other smart cards were used to sign certificates.
Let's get a Kickstarter campaign started so I can put together a project to go over there and kick these guys in the nuts. This is ridiculous.
So I have a link to more coverage from a Dutch website, although it's in Dutch, so I couldn't read it. And I didn't want to use the machine translation, but the link's there if you want to machine translate it and see what you can figure out. And then there's a link to the full report, which is in English.
I gotta, Alan. I mean, many.
Apparently, the project was called Black Tulip.
That's adorable.
Well, because it's Dutch, right? They're really into tulips.
I gotta ask you. We have not yet really had a story where they do this kind of island hopping thing where a Windows box is not where there's not a Windows box involved. It seems like it's always a Windows box. And you look at like Norton's quote about this and how we're doing all this legislation, or we're going to, for cybersecurity because of all these malware attacks. Is Microsoft going to be to blame for the massive crackdown and lockdown that's going to happen? Is this at some level Microsoft's fault?
Well, we don't know if it was using zero-day exploits or if it was exploits that Microsoft had already patched and Diginotar had just not installed the patches.
Could be negligence on the admin's part.
But the real question is, why is any certificate authority running Windows for their certificate authority servers? And, obviously they had a policy to make sure that those servers weren't accessed from the internet, but some people were not following that policy, and an Office PC was able to access the secure network when it shouldn't have been able to.
I don't even mean to be a Windows bigot. Like if a Windows server is the right solution, I can recommend it. But it just seems like in these types of scenarios, it is near negligence to implement it on Windows just because of the sheer amount of attacks out there and compromises, as this proves.
Basically.
I mean, it could have happened on a Linux box, but when we hear these stories, almost always it's happening, at least at some portion, they've compromised something in Windows that's low-hanging and ridiculous. And we see this with that island hopping approach, and it just drives me nuts. Because, when it's something like certificates, I mean, that's sort of like fundamental to our trust system online.
It is. And that's why, these certificate authorities should have to be audited more strongly.
Yeah, there you go. But who would do the auditing?
Some auditing company.
Let's you and me do it.
It's a giant waste of money, but anyway.
You and I could set up a contracting business, $100,000. We go in there, we audit them for 2 days, and then we come back on the show and report everything we found. So it's also show prep. It's like a win-win.
There you go.
All right, well, that's all the news. And Alan's got a ton of links this week and a ton of show notes. He's broke down like the timeline, a lot of stuff in the show notes this week, so you guys can go check that out. Right, Alan?
Yep.
All right, well, then with all that done, then that means it's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com or filling out the contact form that we have linked at the top of the site or starting a thread in our subreddit at links.techsnap.tv. All right, Mr. Allen, are you ready for our first question, sir?
Yep.
Comes in from Matthew, and I believe he's in search of an SPF record. It goes on and says, "Hi, guys. Thanks for the great show. Been a listener since the very first episode and haven't missed a single one since. I donate monthly through PayPal." Well, thank you, Matthew. "And enjoy several JB shows during my daily commute." He says, "I got a question for TechSNAP. I'm running a GoDaddy-hosted PHP BB form using the JB promo codes, of course. My email keeps getting marked as spam by Yahoo and Hotmail, and most users of my form do not check their junk folder at all. I found this out when people complained that they did not receive their registration confirmation emails. I solved this by disabling email confirmation requirement, but, then, of course, he wants to be able to send emails, so that doesn't really fix the problem. He says, I contacted GoDaddy support, and they recommended that I create an SPF record for my domain. What is an SPF record, and why do I need it? So he's wondering if there's other things he should do, too, so that way it doesn't get considered marked as spam. So what do you think, Alan? What's an SPF record, and why does he need it?
SPF is the Sender Policy Framework. It's basically a little TXT record you put in your DNS that lists which servers are allowed to send email on your behalf. So basically, to prevent a lot of spam does spoofing, right? So some compromised computer in the States or some spam server in China will send an email to a bunch of people with the from domain set as my domain. And then it looks like I'm sending the spam when I'm not. So they came up with this thing called the Sender Policy Framework, which basically, as a DNS record, I publish a list of the servers that are allowed to send mail on my behalf. So, it says this IP address or any IP that has this in the reverse DNS or any of the MX servers listed on this domain are allowed to send email for me. And if you get mail from any other server, there's the option of saying that, accept it anyway, don't consider it as a positive or a negative, or reject it based on the fact that it's not from anybody on the allowed list.
And we should say, the reason why it's hit and miss is because it's voluntary if people check for this SPF record before they receive your email.
Although most people do. The thing is, they can't be too strict about it because a lot of people don't publish the record, and some people do it incorrectly. Or, people will publish an SPF record and then send mail from a server not on the list.
Yeah.
Google has a good document about it if you use Google Apps for your domain. So if you're doing Gmail but on your own domain name, they have a good write-up on how to set it up.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the SPF record also supports an operator called include, where you can say, get the list of servers from this domain at Google. That way, Google can update their records without you having to update your records because you're just referencing the Google list.
And
because I think you had to add records to JupiterBroadcasting.com to SPF for MailChimp, right?
And GoDaddy has really good documentation on that too. He mentioned you registered it, so you can check their help docs there, and they'll actually give you screenshots on how to set it up. And I think they even have a wizard now for specifically for SPF.
And if you Google for it, there are a couple of tools to help you test your SPF records and make sure they're valid, and also to help you write up the list.
Yeah, go to one is mxtools.com. Will test your SPF record.
Yeah, now, I think it's called OpenSPF.org or something. There's a group that defines the standard, and they have some good documentation on how you write the records and check them.
It's kind of a must do if you run an email.
If you're doing any kind of serious mailing, like if you're running a mailing list or something, you may consider also implementing domain keys, which is instead of publishing a list of servers that are allowed, you cryptographically sign every email as it leaves your mail server, and you publish the public key in DNS so that people like Google can get the email, see the signature, check it against your DNS, and know for a fact it came from somebody that has your key. Basically, they know 100% for sure that this email came from your domain. unless you use too small of a key like we talked about last week.
Yes.
But basically, yes. My business partner used to run mailing lists for a couple of companies. Actually, he runs one now for the Ontario government for people subscribed to the homework help system. And so it's like a double opt-in mailing list that's legit, but you want to make sure that it doesn't end up in people's spam folders on Hotmail, Gmail, Yahoo, and so on. Mm-hmm. And so they have SPF records, and they have the domain key signing, and they also get on some whitelists and a bunch of other stuff to make sure.
It's like Alan always says, wear sunscreen.
Yeah.
All right, I stole Bunny's joke from the chat room. By the way, this show's live. Oh, that's not the chat room. This is the chat room. This show is live Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific over at jblive.tv. Oh, the UTC time is going to be changing because we're about to...
Well, no. Yes, sorry. The UTC time will be wrong this week? No,
oh my gosh.
Next week it'll be different. Yeah, I'm a little confused over it.
Just go over to jblive.tv. We'll have a countdown timer. It's just a lot
easier. Our offset from UTC will change, so next week it'll be 2100, I think.
Okay, well, when we get it right, we'll put it in the show notes. But all right, so this next email is probably, do you use LastPass? This one might be a little more directed at me if you don't.
I don't, but you've done lots about it. So.
Yeah, so Bozastion, I'm sorry if I really actually did butcher that. He comes in, he says, hello, I love your show, and I've learned a lot from you. What I also love is the in-depth explanation not only of theory of the view, but also from a live experiences point of view. Last time you mentioned that you also used LastPass. I have 2 questions regarding LastPass. At my work, I also log into several online services, like about 60 of them. Some of them are Google accounts, so I have Chrome and Firefox and IE opened up at the same time. Boy, do I know that one. I have Safari and Chrome open right now on this computer. My first concern is how safe is LastPass? The data saved on my computer, Chrome, Firefox, IE extensions. The data traveling from my computer to LastPass servers and back. How safe is all of this? Data saved on LastPass's servers, automatic fill-out forms, and all of that. Is it safe? Can it be captured by a keylogger or any other software, like say maybe a screen capture? How is data put into the form? In short, how safe is LastPass, and what about on Android? He also wants to know if he leaves himself logged in to LastPass on his computer at work, is there a way to remotely log out of his LastPass session once he gets home? So some of the basics here is one thing is I think that would address your concerns about the security is one of the things I like is LastPass encrypts locally before it transmits, so it's not transmitting it's not encrypting at their end. The client software is actually encrypting the results locally and then sends them that.
Yeah, the entire idea there is that you make sure that you have the key and they don't have the key, so they can't decrypt it.
Right. So, and then the other question he had is the auto logout thing. If you don't set LastPass to remember your password, then it will ask you to log in every time you start your browsing session. So every time you launch Chrome or every time you launch Firefox, the first time you launch it, it'll ask you for your password. It'll stay logged in until you close the browser again. On top of that, one of the things you can do is you can also then pair it with two-factor authentication, either from a YubiKey or Google Authenticator, and then you can have it remember your password, but it won't actually open up the vault until you also give it something you have, like a PIN code that's generated from Google Authenticator. And that's a really nice way to kind of lock it down. And that's supported on Android. They do the encryption the same on Android. So yeah, if you have to track a lot of logins, man, it's so nice because like you can put all of the different logins into groups. So I have a Jupiter Broadcasting group. I have groups for each one of my clients because, as I work at a client for a few months, I end up with like 15, 20 sites that I'm logging with their accounts for like licensing information or whatever it is. And I don't want to have to go to them every time or look it up in my email every damn time. But I also don't want it cluttering up all of my stuff. So I just put it right there in there, and it's rock solid. I really recommend LastPass, and it is the modern day must-have sort of protection system you need in place with a lot of online accounts. Is you need to have different passwords for every site you use, and I know it's a huge pain in the ass, but you got to do it. And he mentions using it on mobile. It is kind of a pain in the butt on mobile to type in these complicated passwords. And I would say the one main vulnerability LastPass really probably has is I'm not sure how it fills out the forms in the web browser, but if it's using the clipboard, you could have other applications that are running on your computer reading your clipboard.
Yeah, or if it's using like send keys to simulate you typing it, a keylogger would pick that up.
So that I'm not quite sure how it does.
A software keylogger would, hardware one wouldn't.
Also, Sword Saint is mentioning in the IRC, and I should give this mention because I don't mention it enough. KeyPass X. There's some other really great ones. I personally love LastPass. I even became a premium like $1 a year or whatever it is subscriber. But yeah, so good luck with that, and check out LastPass. Make yourself more secure. All right, Alan, the next email comes in from Scott, and he has a security scenario for us. It says, in a shared hosting situation where one shared web server has many sites connecting to a dedicated separate database server, say, for instance, the web server is compromised and an attacker has root access on that web server. Is there any way they could then also somehow get access to the database server? Or does having a physically separate database server sufficiently add protections? Scott, what do you think, Alan?
It depends on a couple things. If root access to, if you can log into MySQL as root from the other machine without a password, then no protection if they're root, right? Or if there is a password but it's saved in a .my.cnf file in root's home directory, like it often is, again, no protection there. So you have to make sure that in order to access anything from box one, or to access the database from the web server box, when you're doing it regularly as the administrator, you should have to enter the password every time. Otherwise, if someone gets root, they wouldn't have to enter the password either, right?
You know what's really scary is I can't tell you how many clients of mine have the Apache user or the www data user have a key login to some system, so that way they can execute like rsyncs through web scripts and stuff. It's super common. So yeah.
And so that's not good. But also, now they might not be able to get root access to the database server, but if you have root on the web server, you can then go into each shared web hosting customer, look at, say they have WordPress, look in their WordPress config file, get the username and password for their particular MySQL account, log in, drop their database, then repeat for each customer. Much easier. You could basically script it if it's almost all WordPress, Drupal, and Joomla or something like that.
Yeah.
Because those all have the username and password for the database will be in a predictable location every time. And you could basically, without ever having root access to the database server, drop most of the databases or otherwise, or just dump them, right? Don't delete them, just steal the databases. You know, if it's like vBulletin for a forum or something, there's all the usernames and passwords. Same for e-commerce stuff, especially if the e-commerce app doesn't store things like credit cards when it shouldn't.
So,
and really, there's not much of a way around that. You can't store the MySQL username and password in anything other than plain text in the config file, because you need the plain text in order to be able to log in.
True. So you're saying not really significantly much more secure?
It helps somewhat. It keeps them from, they wouldn't necessarily automatically get root on the database server.
Right.
But they would probably still have access to the databases themselves.
Yeah. All right. So there you go, Scott.
So you got to keep everything secure as you can.
Flash. Oh, sorry, Alan. Go ahead.
It was in my notes, but I didn't actually cover it this week. I'll try to maybe cover it next week. There was a system somebody's devised to do for instead of using just SSH keys with no passwords for doing your like rsyncs remotely. They've come up with this system called like key chaining or something. I forget what it was called, where it would basically allow you to go through a couple of steps so that you can still automate rsyncing stuff, but have it be more secure than just having an unencrypted SSH key.
All right, I have a flash update from the IRC chat room. JB Viewer 468956 stopped by really quickly to mention that LastPass also does have an option where you can say log out all other active sessions. So that
cool.
that kind of addresses his question. Yep. So there you go, Scott. A little better off, but you still really got to watch yourself. All right, now this next one is interesting, and I wonder if a few people haven't been sparked by this notion since we've been talking about ZFS so much. Comes in from the letter S, and he says, gentlemen, first off and foremost, your shows are amazing, informative, high quality, produced, and greatly edited. Keep up the great work. Well, thank you, S. My question, I have a Debian box running on an Atom CPU. Matched with an NVIDIA Ion for hardware accelerated video, running XBMC, SAB-NZB, Sickbeard, Couch Potato, Samba, and NFSD, i.e. awesome. And some other less used items like Deluge and a Mule. The storage is an array of 6 unmatched drives running from an onboard SATA and from an extension PCI SATA card, all parts of a single LVM group. I'm a long fan of FreeBSD and used to work on it a few years back, stopped around version 7 or so, and now I want to move my rig to FreeBSD instead of Debian. Ooh, geez. Oh, boy. Gosh. Oh, my goodness. The host of Linux Action Show cries. Uh, is there a way to easily convert the LVM to ZFS without using a third medium? I'm okay with mounting the LVM in FreeBSD and taking the disk one by one off the LVM and onto the ZFS array, but I'm not even sure that's possible. Thanks in advance.
Right. Somebody else has asked me a similar question before, and I don't remember if I answered it on the show or not. But yeah, basically what I concluded what you would have to do is clear up enough free space on the LVM to remove hopefully the largest disk, if not something not the smallest disk, basically. So free up enough space to remove one of the disks. You basically have to do an operation that you shrink the LVM and remove one of the disks. I forget what the tool for it is called, but I can look it up if you can find it by Googling.
We did talk about this a little bit because I had just got done doing something like this.
Basically, shrink the LVM enough to take one of the disks out, make that the first disk in your new ZFS pool, fill that disk up until you freed enough space to remove a second disk, and repeat ad nauseum. Although I don't know if you can even mount an LVM in FreeBSD. I think you might be able to, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And if not, then you have to mount it with one of those, like the Fuse ZFS in Debian, till you load it up, and then export it, and then import it properly on FreeBSD and upgrade it to the newer version.
That's what I was thinking.
But the downside of doing it this way is when you're basically going to mess with ZFS algorithm for distributing the writes so that one disk isn't full. It was actually the problem I had with my first ZFS array because I was transitioning from UFS to ZFS. I had a bunch of separate drives that I said, all right, this drive holds this type of data, this drive holds this type of data, and this drive holds this type of data. And I was like, well, right now I have 50 gigs of free space on each of the three drives, but I need 70 gigs for this file. And so I can't fit it. It's a pain in the ass. Yeah. So I was like, if I switch to ZFS, all my free space will be available for any one operation. And so I moved the drives over one at a time, but it ended up, the first two drives were almost full and the newest drive was almost empty. And so when I was writing, it was staggering the writes. So it would only write 5 megabytes a second to the full drives and 40 megabytes a second to the bigger drive. But it basically slowed me down a lot and it just wasn't great. So the read, when I was reading, it would only be using one of the disks to read the file because the file only existed on one disk. So I wasn't getting the speed I could have got if I had filled the drives up evenly. Even if they're not all the same size, because it'll spread it out a bit, it knows how much free space there is on each drive, and it aims it so that they'll all fill up at the same time. Right? So it divides the file based on how big each drive is and spreads it out.
Yeah.
But it can't do that if one of the drives is more full than the other. So, yeah. If at all possible, you want to just start a new array. But if not, you have to basically move disks over one at a time, and I'm not sure about if you can mount an LVM inside BSD or not.
That would be the
I've been lucky enough never have to. Basically, my usual solution for Linux box is kill it with fire. Right? It's leave the Linux box up long enough for me to set up the BSD box, transition everything over, and then kill it with fire.
Jeez, Alan.
Usually I end up turning the old Linux box into a fresh FreeBSD box as the backup or slave of the new FreeBSD box.
I'd be curious to see how it works out for you, S. So let us know.
Yeah.
All right, Alan. Let's talk about a DIY SSD drive. Are you ready for this one?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this email comes in from Ivan, and he says, now get ready for this. I had a lot of problems with various SSD drives, for example, the high price firmwares with a lot of bugs. And of course, he's even ran into a few bricked SSDs with no support. And he's also had some models that behave strange with extended forward, but works fine with NTFS. Wear leveling is not a trivial problem, and it looks like most of the manufacturers got it wrong. As performance is its main marketing thing, to make things worse, they introduced compression and deduplication. I didn't know that. So why would anyone want to buy something like this? He suggests a simple plan. Buy a lot of flash chips, get a dumb controller that only knows how to read and write, and a file system which knows where and how often to write. A little caveat here, I'm a hardware enthusiast. I make custom PCBs. I'm not afraid of soldering, but my programming skills really suck. And then, boom, you've got Alan coming along with NAND FS. He says, a light bulb goes off here. I tried Googling this around, but I'm wondering, could you build a custom SSD drive by a big collection of flash chips, putting them all together with some sort of controller, and then throwing free BSD at it with something like NAND FS? What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's the whole point of NAND FS. Now, the NAND FS currently only works with one specific device, which they're basically doing as the reference implementation. It's a little Marvel plug computer. It's basically, the size of the power brick for most people's laptop or whatever, and you just plug it in the wall, and it has an Ethernet port, and it's a whole computer. But yeah, there are some manufacturers doing something like this. A lot of the ones that do the $100,000 SANs and stuff, they have ones that are just giant boards full of flash chips, and then they have their own custom something like NAND FS to read and write to them.
NAND, not NAND, NAND.
NAND. It's something to do with chips. I forget what it is. But yeah, there's a nice there's a wiki or a FreeBSD wiki article about it.
Look at that FreeBSD. There's a FreeBSD wiki. Well, look at that. That FreeBSD is just really keeping up with the times.
Well, it's a good way to summarize random bits of information that normally would only be found on a mailing list.
I'm just feeling bad these days, Alan. I got to take any pot shots I can to defend my Linux.
So basically, the technology is not really, or the software is not really mature enough to manually run the NANDs like this.
Yeah.
But it's something we could end up looking at because it definitely has its advantages. It's much easier to change the software to deal with problems with the flash chips than it is to try to have it done by a controller that you can't really update. Or, some of them you can flash, but there's always the risk of bricking it in that case, as opposed to with a software update is you have a little, if it doesn't work properly, you can always do a live CD or something and fix it
and rescue it. Yeah, no kidding.
But yeah, in the future, maybe all SSDs will actually be this way. You'll be addressing the flash directly instead of having some part of the drive making the flash pretend it's a hard drive when it's not. Because we can probably definitely get more speed out of the SSDs if we stop treating them like they're spinning hard drives.
What's interesting is all of the Apple laptops that have solid state now, the solid state doesn't even come in like a drive enclosure. It's like just solid state chips soldered onto the motherboard. It's like all one integrated thing. And they don't have a separate drive.
Right, but I'm pretty sure they still use a controller to make it appear as a block device.
I wonder if that's kind of, the kind of trend that we're going to see is maybe we'll just see stores.
Well, you can, Fusion IO makes PCI cards full of chips that you plug in and it shows up as a hard drive.
Yeah. Boy, I can't wait till my hard drive comes with like 120 gigabytes of storage just built in. Or I mean my motherboard. You buy this new Asus motherboard, 120 gig storage just built in right there. That's going to happen.
My newest Gigabyte or Asus, I forget, motherboard that's in my file server has a slot for a tiny SSD that you just slot into the motherboard.
No kidding.
SATA.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually like removable though. It's not soldered
awesome.
into the motherboard.
That's perfect.
Yep.
I like that.
And then actually the case I'd have has a 2.5-inch hot swap slot hanging out of the front of it. So if you have just an external, like a 2.5-inch laptop drive, you can just shove it in the front of the PC like it was a USB card.
I love that.
And then read it. It's especially useful at the college where I used to teach. They now mandate that you have to have a 2.5-inch external drive to carry your VMware images around on, or VirtualBox images.
Really?
So that rather than having to always be in a specialty lab that has a couple of 2 terabyte hard drives to hold all the images.
Yeah.
Or it's also so that you have persistence, right? You have a 2.5-inch hard drive, you save your virtual machine to it, you work on it, and when you sit at a different PC next week, your half-finished work is still there.
That's the beautiful thing about
you can
virtualization.
take it home with it.
Yeah. That's sweet.
So this way you can plug it in via SATA instead of USB, so you're not getting the hampered speed.
One of the things I do is when I'm at my clients, I actually primarily operate out of a VM most of the time. Mm-hmm. And then if I have something I need to continue, like for that client when I get home, I sit down at my bigger computer with my 30-inch cinema display and I just launch the VM image. I just load the VMware image off my laptop over the network because it's a gigabit network, and I run the whole VM on a completely different system for a few hours, and I shut it down. And I continue on the laptop. It's awesome. I love it.
Yep.
Now you've got a war story before we get out of the feedback.
Oh, we have 2 follow-ups first.
Oh, all right. Let's see.
DreamHost, who changed their SSH keys the other day, and we were talking about how it was really annoying that they didn't publish a list of what the valid SSH keys are.
Right.
They've announced via their Twitter that if you log into their control panel and go under users, there's now a list of SSH keys for each of their servers so that you can correctly ID which host is which and make sure that you're getting the valid SSH key when you try to connect.
Oh, good. Oh, good. All right, so that's
I like
one.
to think that maybe it was because I yelled at them.
I wonder. Maybe,
I'm pretty sure it would be because a bunch of their customers yelled at them in the feedback to the original thread. But either way, it's they're doing it right now. It may have taken them 6 extra days, but...
And hopefully they'll do it right from now on.
Yeah. And then Slashdot has an Ask Slashdot question about those the TSA pre-check system. And
with
there's
the
more discussion about reading those barcodes and modifying them. Although, remember, it is illegal to tamper with or modify your boarding pass.
I just want to know if I'm going to be specially screened or not. They would...
Reading the barcode will tell you whether... Well, no, sorry, the barcode tells you whether you get exempt from regular screening or not.
Okay.
Basically, if you're on a list of frequent flyers who've been thoroughly scanned once, they're like, yeah, we'll just next time we won't make you take your shoes off or take your laptop out of the bag.
Right. All right, good.
Things up. But anyway.
I still want an app that I can just scan my boarding pass and know. That's what I'm waiting for. Okay, now war story, yes?
Yes, now a war story titled The Little SSH That Sometimes Couldn't.
Oh, punny, Alan. Very punny.
I didn't write it. I didn't come up with the name of the guy that wrote the article.
Oh, okay, I see that. Okay. All right, so what happened?
So Mina Nagub is a sysadmin and the director of engineering at AdGear, which is an advertising firm in Canada. He noticed that some of his SSH cron jobs were starting to report random failures and timeouts while copying logs from his London server to his Montreal server. And he found that the transfers either completed at high speed without any problems or would hang and never complete. He never had an instance where it was just a slow transfer. So either it would work perfectly or it would just get stuck and never finish. But he also found that if he'd ran it manually, it seemed to work fine. It's confused him. But then, when it kept happening and then it started happening when he was doing it manually too, he started examining packets with TCP dump to try to figure out what the problem was.
Okay.
So he's looking at the packets as they're leaving the London server, and he found that he would send some packets, and they would get acknowledged, and everything was going fine. And then certain packet would go through, and it wouldn't get acknowledged. And it'd be retransmitted, and still wouldn't get acknowledged. And eventually it ran into a stalemate where it's, you're sending packets, but you're not getting an answer.
Right.
But meanwhile, you can still ping the host, and some packets get through, but some don't. It was very confusing. So then he started running the TCP dump on the Montreal side, and he noticed that the packets were different when he received them than when he had sent them. He found that the 15th byte of every 16 bytes was being corrupted somehow. But it was being corrupted predictably.
Oh.
So when he's looking at it in TCP dump, which kind of does this really narrow display because it's doing it all in hex and so on, he found that when it's doing the SSH handshake, a bunch of H's would get turned into X's and C's would get turned into S's.
What?
But it would only happen to bytes after the first 576 bytes.
Okay.
So when he found out where it was getting stuck, he Googled it and found that people were reporting problems with Wi-Fi sometimes doing this and other things.
Yeah.
So he started changing the size of his MTU, the maximum transmission unit. And once he got it below 576 bytes, he couldn't make the problem happen. But as soon as he put it back to 1500, the default, he could make the problem happen. So he kind of was wondering what's going on here.
Yeah.
So the SSH sessions were getting stuck because the remote server's kernel was throwing the TCP packet away because it was corrupted. Right? So when Montreal got the packet, it would look at it, sum it up, and say, hey,
it's no good.
The contents don't match the checksum. This packet is corrupted. Ignore it. And so SSH never got it and never acknowledged it. And then, as you would expect, London retransmitted the packet, but it got corrupted again. And so no acknowledgement. And eventually it would just get stuck. So he ruled out issues. The first thought when it's something like that is that it's something wrong with the network card, right?
Okay, sure.
But he'd tried multiple servers on each side and in 2 different data centers in Montreal. So he was sure it wasn't a problem with his hardware on either side.
Right.
So to prove his hypothesis about what was happening, he started up Netcat, which is this great little utility. It's like Telnet, but without any control characters. It literally just gives you a TCP or UDP pipe between 2 points. So he opened it up and basically piped dev0 through Netcat to the other machine, and then analyzed the packets with TCP dump or Wireshark. And he noticed that after the first 576 bytes, the 4th bit of the 15th of every 16 bytes was being stuck at a 1 instead of a 0. So if you look at his blog, there's a little diagram of it. So he's seeing all these zeros, and all of a sudden this one column is turning into 1s. And that's what was changing the H's into X's and the C's into S's and so on. But then he tried it. So the easiest way to try to solve this was something with like a ping. Because a ping, you basically transmit a block of text, and when the other side gets it, it repeats that same block back to you, so you could see where it was happening. But basically, he determined that it wasn't happening with UDP or ICMP packets. Only TCP was being corrupted. So now his task was to pinpoint where this was happening, so he could complain to the right person.
Huh.
Now, this is more difficult because it wasn't unlike with a ping where you're asking the remote side to echo back the same text to you. When it's TCP, you can't really do that. You have to have cooperation with the server on the other side to make it happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, his ISP in London had already routed around the problem so that his connections would work. So he had solved the problem as far as getting his servers to talk to each other properly by getting his ISP in London to route around the problem. But they weren't sure where the problem was yet. And, like a good sysadmin, he didn't want to just fix the problem. He wanted to know what happened.
Right. It doesn't happen again.
Yes. So he broke out Nmap and used its random IP mode and started scanning for random SSH servers.
Awesome.
So he didn't need to log into the server or anything. He just needed to connect and do the key exchange and see if there was corruption was happening.
Yes.
So basically, he picked out a whole list of random ones and started checking, made a list of ones that did experience corruptions and ones that didn't. And then started doing trace routes to all those servers. Now, there's a problem with that setup, is that the internet isn't always symmetrical, right? So just because, the route from me to you goes one path doesn't mean the route from you back to me is going to follow that same path back. Very often, it'll actually go a completely different way. Mm-hmm. And so if it had been on the way back that the corruption was happening, or basically if there was a link that wasn't going the same way both times, the traceroute might not have found the hop that was causing the problem.
I'm really wondering, okay, so what's going on here?
So basically, after he found about 16 SSH servers which he couldn't connect to, and 25 that he could, he was able to narrow down the list of suspects of which hops were causing the problem by doing traceroutes to them. And basically, he found that between London, it would go through one backbone provider, switch over to a different backbone provider, and then arrive in Montreal. And basically, by comparing the trace routes and seeing which routers were in common and which ones weren't, he was able to determine that the problem was somewhere at the connection between the first and second upstream provider. And he reported that, and that went up the line. And eventually, through the first upstream provider, he got confirmation that the problem was actually the connection between the two providers. On the router on the second upstream provider, the internal management module had failed and was corrupting the packets. Now, I don't know if it was something with like the processing or just the memory or the buffers that the packets get stored in, where certain bits were being stuck on, and so they're as the data gets copied in and then copied back out, and it was being stuck on. But it was causing problems with BGP and routing between their networks and causing all kinds of problems, including these corrupt packets. So, they got that router shut off so that the internet just routed around it, and the problem was solved.
Did he say how tough it was to work with them to...
Well, I think he didn't. He basically told his ISP in London, who then complained to Upstream 1, which was their provider, who then talked to Upstream 2 because those two have a peering agreement. And to get a peering agreement, you require a 24/7 knock so that they can debug these kinds of issues quickly. Mm-hmm. Because, the London ISP is paying Upstream 1 to provide access to the internet, and there's a problem preventing that. And so Upstream 1 wants to solve it as quickly as possible. But basically, he had to deal with them kind of at second hand. And then later we found out that it appears the two ISPs were GBLX and Level 3. And I think it was Level 3 that had the problem, although I'm not sure.
Wow. That's a difficult spot in the US.
And if you go to his blog post, he has a bunch of diagrams and stuff where you can see the whole process he went through, and it's actually a really good war story.
Check it out. Link in the show notes for that. Wow. Now, if you want to send a war story to us, we're happy to accept them. Or if you just have a question for the show, you can email that to techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com, or hit that contact us link at the top of our website, or start a thread in our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv. All right, Mr. Allen, I think that's all our feedback for this week, yeah?
Yep.
All right, then. That means it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. And welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are links that didn't quite make it to the top of the show, but we still want to talk about them. Maybe you'd like to go check them out, so we have them linked up in the show notes. And almost all of them are exclusively provided, except for when they're not, by our subreddit over at links.techsnap.tv. All right, Alan, you ready for the first Roundup story?
Yep.
I'll just do this as a quick shout out to the OpenBSD project. OpenBSD 5.2 was released yesterday on Halloween, very spooky, and the general availability is out there now. It's the 33rd twice yearly release of this project. So congratulations to them.
If you're paranoid about security, probably the best OS to run.
That's a great way to put it. Yes. All right. Now, this next story was really well voted on our subreddit, and I didn't get a full chance to grok the whole article, but what they're talking about here sounds fascinating. They're saying your GPU...
your GPU has a fingerprint that they could use to authenticate you. So the idea is that using it as a second factor for authentication for things like games, like World of Warcraft or Star Wars or whatever, basically every video card has what are called physically unclonable functions, or PUFs, that can be used for two-factor authentication. Basically, they found when they do raw access to the memory chips after they've been powered down, before they've been used, that certain bits will be set to 0 and certain set to 1 until the memory is cleared and actually initialized. And that basically that's random enough that no two cards are going to have the same pattern.
And it's always the same pattern?
Apparently. You'd have to read the whole article. It's really long. But
wow, that's fascinating.
Basically, there's a couple of things that are unclonable about your video card, meaning that there's no two cards that'll be the same and could be used as an extra authentication step. Now, they don't point it out here, but as a downside, it could also be used as a DRM thing.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. I was just thinking tracking.
Right. That would require something to have access to your card.
Yeah.
But, so while you could use it as a second factor for logging into a game to make sure that somebody can't steal your World of Warcraft account, a game could also be locked to your video card so that you couldn't pirate it, basically. Or so that a second person couldn't use your license on another machine. Or so that you couldn't run your copy of the game on two different machines.
Well, and as the article points out, they say the GPU could be the validation that allows only certain PCs to access certain resources on a network. For example, a C-level executive could have their own secured private space on the corporate network, which only they can access with their PC's GPU acting as the authentication.
Yep.
That's really interesting stuff.
But that doesn't authenticate the person that's sitting at the machine. It just authenticates the machine is the one you're expecting.
Good point. Right. Good point.
Depending how you do it, how do I know that it's not someone just sending me the signature of somebody else's computer?
And you got to figure it varies.
Cryptographically sign that somehow, and if it's on the computer, then it gets complicated.
Well, Alan, brace yourself because it's time for another scare. Backdoors and computer controls open critical infrastructures to hackers. Yeah. This is coming from arstechnica.com.
More critical infrastructure run by bad software.
Yeah, it's basically, you just summed up this entire write-up in that one sentence. They say it's systems sold by 261 different manufacturers. And some of these are newer systems, like powered by ARM chips, and some of them even have Linux on them. Some of them have Windows CE.
Yeah, but having Linux on it doesn't make it secure, especially if the login is like the MAC address, and the MAC address is printed in the login screen.
Right,
and things like that.
Yeah. Very true. All right.
Or if every one of them uses the same SSL key, or the 100 other things that we've talked about.
Now, if the critical infrastructure thing, like the pumps failing and stuff like that, hasn't scared you, maybe this will scare you. There's been a medical pump recall for bugs that cause inaccurate readings on touchscreens.
Not just that. So basically, there's a bug in these infusion pumps that they use at hospitals, where sometimes the pump would just ignore the touchscreen interface. So you'd say, pump something into this person, and it wouldn't. Or you'd say, lower the dosage by this much, and then it wouldn't. Or what it would show on the screen wouldn't match what it was actually doing. So, the nurse thought she was turning down your painkillers, and she was turning them up or whatever. And they've issued a voluntary recall instead of a mandatory recall, which would seem more in line for this particular issue. But
jeez. I mean, it's like basic QA testing right there they didn't do.
Yeah.
I would think, unless maybe it only crops up after hours of operation or something.
I think it's just shoddy software.
Yeah. It's so funny how...
shoddy hardware. And
before the smart screen era, and even still after, now there's no excuse, but before the smart screen era, there weren't really good touchscreens in wide use. Nowadays, though, there's just no excuse for it. The technology has been figured out.
When the old system were more mechanical, like if you turned a dial and it opened or closed a valve...
Right.
That's hard. That's pretty foolproof.
Yeah.
It's either working or it's broken. Whereas a software bug means that sometimes the touch interface doesn't actually change the valve.
I don't understand, even being somebody who loves technology and tries to integrate into every facet of his life, I don't understand why we replace some of these things with...
Well, in this case, the idea would be that the nurses could monitor the medication you're getting from remotely. There's one big monitoring station that can monitor everybody's... Or they could even possibly reprogram it remotely.
Seems like there should be a way to do both. But yeah, I know.
But basically, it just seems like this software needs to be better tested and maybe independently tested.
Aha!
If it's a pump like this, some auditing company has to hook up the machine and measure what it's actually pumping out versus what it says on the screen and put it through a set of tests.
Yes. All right, well, why don't we cover this story that affected Zappos? And it's pretty interesting. If you run a website and you have a terms of service agreement on your website in January... remember this story, hackers got a hold of 24 million Zappos customers' emails and addresses. So they got sued by some of those customers, Zappos
Some of the customers sued them, yes.
And
Zappos said, well, according to the terms of service you agreed to when you signed up with us, your only option is arbitration. You can't sue us.
I hate that, by the way.
A court threw that out and said that the terms of service are invalid and that you can't take away people's rights just because you wrote it down.
Right. I guess the whole thing hinged on the fact that because the user wasn't forced to click through the terms of service, it's thereby not binding. So it's something to think about if you really want them to stick to that terms of service. So tomorrow when you go to jupiterbroadcasting.com and a pop-up... No, I'm kidding. Yeah. That would be so awful. I already get enough of those cookie ones that I'm just driving me nuts.
Yes, that's a silly law in the UK.
Gosh, I know. All right.
So you, maybe.
We have a story coming out of networkworld.com. Irked by cyberspying, Georgia outs Russia-based hacker with photos.
Yes. So Georgia, as in the country, not the state, basically published a bunch of photos and other information about some Russian hackers who had been repeatedly cyber spying on them and breaking into various government entities and stealing information.
That's too funny. Just take it to him directly.
I don't know how they got a picture of the guy. It's very strange.
Well, it looks like it's from his webcam. I don't know. And of course, classically, the guy in one of them has his shirt off. How many people sit in front of their computer with their damn shirt off? I guess just about everybody but me.
Depends on the temperature.
Okay. Yeah.
If it's over 30 degrees in my house, I'm not putting a shirt on except for when the video camera's on.
That's true. Or if it's super late at night and I can't sleep sometimes. Well, I mean, we don't need to get into that. All right. So this next story hits close to home for me. With the election season in full robo swing, FTC escalates anti-robocalling campaign and takes out 5 mass callers.
Yes. Specifically, there were companies that would call and say they were from the cardholder services for your. Basically, they were pretending they were from your bank, but never mentioning your bank's name. They'd be like, "Hi, this is Rebecca from Cardholder Services," making you think they're calling from your credit card company, but they're not. And then they would try to offer you a lower rate, but in the end, when you got all the way to the end of it, they're like, "Yes, if you pay us a bunch of money, we'll make sure you get a lower rate on your credit card." And then either they wouldn't do anything at all they would do is a conference call with you, them, and your bank, where they would ask your bank to lower your interest rate. Your bank would say no, and then that was that.
Yeah.
You can call up your credit card company and ask for a lower rate all you want. It's not going to do anything.
Right. Unless you are really lucky and pretend like you're going to cancel. Every now and then they'll send you to the retention department and get you a rate.
Yeah. You have more luck with your cell phone company with that than with your credit card.
Or your cable TV service.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I've gotten some luck with that. All right. And I really was going to cancel, so, what are you going to do? Let's cover this next story.
You fell for it. You tricked them. But anyway.
I find this kind of interesting. The 4 major carriers are planning to work together to create a joint stolen cell phone database in the U.S.
Yes. So the government's been asking for this for a while. The U.S. carriers will basically make a database. If your phone gets stolen, its hardware numbers go into this database, and no one will be able to activate that phone on a new plan. Because apparently, especially in places like New York, like 40% of all thefts involve somebody stealing your smartphone. But when iPhones are worth $500 or $600 or $700, then that makes sense.
They're kind of the smartphone's the new hot item. So
Now you wonder how the phone companies aren't. It's like I know what the serial number for my phone was, and how do you not just be like, hey, police, somebody else activated my phone. Would you mind going and arresting them, please?
I don't even know if I follow why. I mean, I guess it's good, but it's not like, so if you took my Sprint phone right now, you couldn't make it work on Verizon or you couldn't make it work on AT&T. It's not like you only need to disable it with the one carrier because they're here in the US, they're all
some
locked.
Phones are unlocked. If you buy the Google Nexus 4, it's not locked.
Yeah, that's going to be like the first major phone people are buying unlocked, though. I mean,
and a lot of them can be unlocked.
I guess it's a good idea. Yeah, it's still a good idea.
Although, a database of cell phones sounds like a bad idea, but this
that's what I was thinking.
It's supposed to only be for stolen ones, but we'll see.
Well, yeah. All right. Well, this next story is very germane to the folks on the East Coast, and of course, our thoughts go out to them. A little article here on how to recover water-damaged hardware.
Yes. Specifically, if your cell phone or computer or whatever gets wet, first thing is don't try to turn it on.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are tempted to, let's see if it works. And then when it doesn't, then they try to fix it. It's like, no, you got to start from the beginning. So, they cover everything from, trying to get all the water out of it, burying it in rice, because rice tries to suck the moisture out of it.
Right.
How to try to deal with, especially if it was salt water, it'll start to corrode the metal components. So you got to try to clean it off properly. And it walks through a bunch of the steps for that might allow you to save some of your gear that might have got wet, whether that's you dropped it in a mud puddle or if it was because of a hurricane.
All right. So our next story, which is a good one, go check that out. For anyone, really. Just good little steps to know, because you need to know some of that stuff right when the water damage happens. So if you don't already know it, you should go check it out. As of today, Alan, which would be a couple of days ago, the FBI is working 24/7 to track and investigate hackers and network attacks.
Yes. Apparently before they only worked office hours.
I guess, when
denial of service attacks or whatever happened overnight, they would deal with it next day or something. I don't know that this is that big of a policy change, because
well, it's funny. Remember,
for some of the stuff, maybe it's only easy to catch the people in real time. But then you're obviously going to require help from the network operations centers of ISPs and so on. So I don't know if this has any extra value or if it's just a giant overtime program.
Well, that could be. I think it's funny is the seed of this article reference is a press release, right? So the FBI actually released their National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force released this press release. Now, what's funny is earlier this month, the U.S., the federal agencies are demanding more information sharing without identifying obstacles to the Canadian government. In fact, they criticize...
We just signed an agreement to cooperate with them.
They criticize the Canadian government for not working 24/7 on cybersecurity in this article. And it's so funny that the FBI just comes and says, okay, well, now we're working 24/7. It's like, well, you guys weren't in the first place.
It's at the top of the list there, is that one of the reasons might be because...
They were criticizing Canada just a couple of weeks ago for it. Yeah. I mean, like, literally, kettle, pot is black. There you go, folks. You can find links to all of those stories in the show notes. Alan, that was a big show.
Yes.
Holy moly. All right. Well, so we invite you to join us live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific, which is?
4 p.m. Eastern. And if my math is right, that'll be 2100 UTC from now on.
Okay, you could be like JB Fan in the chat room and just put like a little clock widget on your smartphone that is set to Pacific time. Or like what I do in like my system clock is I add like East Coast and UTC in my little system clock area. That's one way to keep track. You can also just listen to the audio if you're at work or on the road and you have a 3G phone or a 4G phone. Go over to jblive.info and you can stream the audio versions of this very show. And just to plug, this Sunday on the Linux Action Show, if you've been following the Lightworks video editor that's been coming to Linux, the industrial-grade video editing application, finally, something serious. Well, there's been a very, very, very limited set of people that have gotten their hands on this alpha version of Lightworks, and one of those was our very own Matt. So we'll be giving a preview of Lightworks in this Sunday's edition of the Linux Action Show. So I encourage everyone to tune in and check that out, as well as all the other stuff we'll be covering. All right, Alan, well, there you go. That's the whole show, right? Yeah? Thank you, sir, for a great show. Lots of interesting stuff to follow, and I'll be checking the show notes to sort of recap. So.
Yep.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much for tuning in to this week's episode of TechSNAP, and we'll see you right back here next week.